Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. The Trump administration issued a new executive order on Monday to further intensify the economic sanctions against Venezuela. These new sanctions freeze all property and assets of the Venezuelan state in the United States and of any individuals who assist Venezuelan government officials. The order was clearly issued with the intent to make a splash at an international conference on Venezuela held in Lima, Peru on Tuesday. Representatives from 50 governments gathered there to discuss how to push Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from office. The governments of Cuba, Russia, China, and Turkey were also invited, but they rejected the invitation. National Security Advisor John Bolton was there, of course, where he outlined the new sanctions. Here's a short clip of what he had to say to the press.
So basically, one way to summarize this to a business, for example, is do you want to do business in Venezuela? Or do you want to do business with the United States? And I think for any international corporations, whether they're US-based, European, wherever they may be, to the boards of directors and shareholders, they ought to be asking their management if it's worth risking for a trickle of income from the illegitimate Maduro government, if it's worth risking their business in the United States.
These latest U.S. sanctions against Venezuela are on top of a continuously intensifying sanctions regime that began under President Obama in 2015 against individual government officials and has led to a nearly total embargo against business dealings between the U.S. and Venezuela under President Trump. Joining me now to discuss the latest sanctions is Francisco Rodriguez. He's chief economist for Torino Economics in New York City, where he conducts regular economic analysis of Venezuela and Latin America more generally. Also, he's a former advisor to opposition presidential candidate Henry Falcón, who ran against President Maduro in 2018. Thanks for joining us, Francisco.
Hi, Greg. Great being here with you.
So some analysts have said that these new sanctions won't make much of a difference because the earlier sanctions already blocked most of the economic transactions between the U.S. and Venezuela. What do you think? What effect will these new sanctions have on the Venezuelan economy and its ability to import and export?
Well, I think that if you look at the executive order that was published a couple of days ago, that's actually true from the standpoint of the letter of the law. This executive order doesn't change that much because the big change came in January. And remember, there have been previous sanctions, but there have also been decisions, policy decisions by the U.S. government that have had significant economic implications for Venezuela, and particularly the decision to recognize Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela. Now, putting aside the constitutional issues, there's a real issue there of recognizing a government that does not have de facto control over at least part of its territory. This is the first time that the U.S. does this since World War II. And the problem there is that once they did that, they effectively froze the assets of the Venezuelan government because the asset from Maduro's standpoint, because Maduro no longer had control to bank accounts in the U.S. after Guaido was recognized. So what these sanctions do is just codify that. I mean, yes, they freeze the assets, but Maduro hasn't had access to those assets for the past 7 months. Now, what I think we're seeing here, more than focusing on the change in legislation, I would focus on the change in policy. And what the words that you showed from Bolton clearly underscore is that the U.S. is now explicitly threatening third countries that do business with Venezuela with what are known as secondary sanctions. In other words, the U.S. has no legal authority to restrict what anybody other than its citizens do. It can restrict what U.S. citizens and what U.S. residents and what U.S. firms do. But the U.S. can't restrict what an Indian firm does because it has no jurisdiction. But the U.S. can impose sanctions on that Indian firm and say, well, since you're collaborating, you're buying oil from the Venezuelan government, then that means that we're going to sanction you and we're going to freeze your assets in the U.S. That the U.S. can do, and that's effectively what Bolton is threatening with doing. And this could be potentially disastrous. I mean, the sanctions have already been a disaster for the Venezuelan economy, but this would take away basically the only lifeline that there is. Venezuelan exports right now, what's left of Venezuelan oil exports are pretty much equally going to India and China. So stopping the Indian market, which is the one that would be kind of more reactive to sanctions or to the threat of secondary sanctions, as well as Malaysia, which is receiving some. Closing off those two markets would take away around 50% of current Venezuelan exports, of what's left of Venezuelan exports, which have already fallen by 85% over the past 7 years.
Now, the executive order specifically exempts food and medicines from being included in the new sanctions. However, the Venezuelan news channel Telesur actually just reported on Wednesday that a ship carrying 25,000 tons of soybeans was seized in the Panama Canal because of the new sanctions, according to the government. Now, what do you make of this exception for food and medicine more generally? Will it do any good?
Well, this exception has been put in sanctions regimes in other countries, and it typically doesn't have any effect. It's very hard to actually use that exception, because what the exception says is that it allows for imports of food, medicine, and clothing necessary to alleviate human suffering. So suppose you're a Venezuelan food importer. How do you know whether the food that you're importing is going to be deemed by the U.S. to be necessary to alleviate or relieve human suffering? If the U.S. was issuing very clear guidelines as to what that means, then that might offer a way to implement it. But since it doesn't, then any firm is just going to say, I'm not going to run the risk of having the U.S. say, oh, you brought this so many tons of rice into Venezuela, but it turns out that some of those were bought by middle-class people, so therefore it wasn't alleviating human suffering, and therefore you're sanctioned. So we get the problem that's sometimes known as overcompliance, which is that based with rules which are not only strict, but also have a lot of discretionality in their interpretation, what the private sector typically does is to say, I won't get involved. And that's effectively what's been happening with these food shipments. I'd also like to point out that you can't buy food. I mean, even if you're allowed to import food, you can't buy food if you don't have money to buy it with. And Venezuela's revenue is generated through its oil exports. So if you block Venezuelan oil exports, you block Venezuela's capacity to pay for food. Therefore, it's meaningless for you to let food into the country if you're not letting oil out.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a very interesting point, especially because there were the sanctions against Iraq, and they had an oil for food program, which of course was riddled with corruption. But not even Venezuela now has that kind of an outlet. But I would just want to turn to the material effect that these sanctions are going to have in the short-term, medium term on Venezuelan people. How have they been affected by the sanctions so far, as you know?
Obviously, these sanctions, or this latest round, is very recent. The main channel, the main effect that through which sanctions influence the Venezuelan economy is through their effect on oil production. And there's been systematic research that's been done on this. I've written some work. Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot have also looked at this issue. And what I've identified, for example, in my work, is that the first round of sanctions, those imposed in 2017, led to a loss of around 800,000 barrels in oil production. So that's valued at $17 billion a year. This year's sanctions have led to another loss of around 400,000 barrels. It's less because Venezuela is not producing that much anymore. And that would be valued at around $9 billion. So you're talking about an aggregate effect of $26 billion. Venezuelan imports last year were $15 billion. So what this means is that if Venezuela had had access to these resources, it could have last year imported 3 times as much as it did. So it's a very significant difference.
Now let's turn to the political impact. Representatives of the Maduro government and of the opposition are currently negotiating in Barbados and in Norway to find a negotiated solution to the crisis. Now, rumors have surfaced recently that Maduro might be willing to hold an early presidential election, which is actually one of the opposition's main demands. The other main demand, which Bolton actually recently amplified and reiterated, is that Maduro resign from the presidency immediately before any new elections take place. And this demand seems quite unlikely to be agreed upon by the government. Now, how do you think that these new sanctions will impact these government opposition negotiations?
Well, it's hard to tell. Obviously they're designed to increase pressure on the Maduro government. And I think to a certain extent they do that. Now, it's not clear that that's going to lead to a negotiated solution because there's already been a huge amount of pressure exerted both on the Maduro regime and on the Venezuelan economy. But in order for you to be able to have that lead you to a negotiated solution, there has to be an agreement, a negotiation leading to an outcome which both sides consider that is acceptable and both sides consider to be an improvement over the current status quo. That's quite difficult to achieve right now. Part of the reason is that Venezuela is essentially a winner-take-all political system where the executive branch has an overwhelming amount of power, where all other branches, the judiciary, electoral, all of the accountability branches, even the legislative power, are essentially subordinated to the executive branch. So what political scientists call the stakes of power are very high in this country. And what that means is that being in power is very good, being out of power is very bad. I think that unless you solve that problem, unless you create incentives for coexistence of Venezuela's feuding political factions and for Venezuelans essentially to have incentives, for these parties to have incentive to collaborate and cooperate for the well-being of the country, that is, unless you build in a power-sharing agreement, then this is always going to be a fight to the finish between these two. And that's what we're still seeing. I mean, we're seeing that the opposition wants to get into power, but that would mean essentially political and maybe even more than political extermination for Chavismo. And it's logical, understandable that Chavismo does not want to accept that. Now, sometimes, and I think what the U.S. is effectively pushing for, or sometimes the discourse of the U.S. tends to suggest that they don't want a negotiation. But if they don't want a negotiation, what do they want? Do they want to put troops on the ground and invade Venezuela? There seems to not to be much willingness or appetite for that in the U.S. Do they want the military to overthrow Maduro? Sure, but they've tried that and that hasn't happened. So it's not clear what the alternative to negotiation is here. But if you're going to go the route of negotiation, which would be what's best for all Venezuelans to have a peaceful solution to the crisis, then you have to accept that both sides are going to play a role, are going to have to play a role in the new Venezuela. You can't build a negotiated solution out of threatening to exterminate the other side.
I think that's a very good point, and actually reminds me of the situation after the Sandinistas lost power. And one of the reasons that they were willing to do so, of course, was because precisely they were allowed to keep control of the military, which isn't right now, it seems, one of the bargaining chips, as you're saying, in the Venezuelan negotiations.
There was something there which was recognition of the Nicaraguan constitution. The Sandinista constitution had originally not been recognized by the opposition. They recognized it. Once they recognized it, then they accepted existing institutions. And yes, you could have a negotiated transition because separation of powers is essentially a way of power sharing. It guarantees that whoever gets into the executive isn't going to have free reign to do everything. If modern democracies, like for example, if the U.S. did not have separation of powers, then we would have a Trump dictatorship right now. So this is really fundamental to the working of a democracy. And that's why I'm very skeptical of these negotiations that try to kind of fast track the solution through an election. Venezuela has had many elections, some of them won by the government, some of them won by the opposition. Typically what happens is that whoever loses them doesn't recognize them. The opposition didn't recognize the 2004 referendum and didn't recognize the 2013 presidential elections. The government didn't recognize the 2015 legislative elections. It let the assembly be sworn in, but then it requested the annulment of the legislators that gave the 2/3 majority to the opposition. So elections, and whether they're recognized or not, and typically they're not recognized by the losing party, they don't really solve Venezuela's problem because in order to solve it, first, you have to generate these institutions for coexistence.
Well, yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the elections by themselves probably wouldn't do it, but certainly I think a power-sharing agreement could be the result of a negotiation in theory if the United States didn't say, oh, negotiations aren't going to lead anywhere right off the bat.
Right. And back in February, Jeffrey Sachs and I wrote an article for the New York Times precisely arguing for this solution, a power-sharing agreement where you would have the cabinet divided between the opposition and the government representatives. a 2-year interim government that would address the humanitarian and the economic crisis, take the country out of hyperinflation, and carry out the institutional and electoral reforms to make sure that there are transparent elections, and also that whoever loses that election has a significant protection against the potential abuse of power by the winner.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Francisco Rodriguez, Chief Economist at Torino Economics in New York City. Thanks again, Francisco, for having joined us today.
Thank you, Greg. Pleasure being here.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.